We're thrilled to present the online launch for Nandita Sharma's new book, Home Rule: National Sovereignty and the Separation of Natives and Migrants, published recently by Duke University Press. Now, this was an event that was supposed to happen in Toronto on March 25th at the University of Toronto in Mississauga and March 26th at the downtown Ryerson campus with the Department of Immigration and Settlement Studies. And, as is happening around, to cancel all of our events, and we've just on YouTube for you tonight. We're going to have a conversation with Nandita Sharma and Joseph Nevins, and we'll also be taking questions from the audience. But before we begin, I'd like to say a warm welcome from everyone at Another Story Bookshop. For those of you who don't know us, we are one of Toronto's oldest independent bookshops with a focus on diversity, social justice, and equity. We have a number of events that we promote and organize throughout the year. And Nandita is an old friend of the bookstores. We have been selling her books for many years, and we're so thrilled to bring you her new book tonight. We have lots of copies in the book that we want to get into your hands. So for those of you who are watching from Toronto, we will be hope to resume our deliveries and pickups, and you can send us an email and we can let you know how soon we can get you her book. For those of you who are watching across Canada, there are many independent bookstores that are sending books out to their communities. Contact them. In the States, there's a lot of bookstores and online independent portals that are getting books to you. And of course, contact Duke University Press directly. They would love to send out Nandita's book. So welcome again, everyone. I would like to begin by introducing Nandita Sharma, who many of you know. She will begin with a discussion from her book, and then we're going to move into a conversation with Joseph Nevins, and we'll end with a Q&A from the audience that is watching us tonight. Nandita Sharma is Professor of Racism, Migration, and Transnationalism in the Department of Sociology at the University of Hawaii in Manoa. She is the author of Home Economics, Nationalism and the Making of Migrant Workers in Canada, and Home Rule: National Sovereignty and the Separation of Natives and Migrants, which we're presenting tonight. Welcome, Nandita.
Hi, Anju. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to have an opportunity to talk with you all about this book. So thank you, Anju, and thank you also to Michael Ranchik, who is doing the tech for this from Another Story Bookshop as well. And of course, to Joseph Nevins for engaging me on this book. So I wish I could see you all in person, and I'm hoping that one day that will actually happen. So let me begin by talking about the promises that national sovereignty proposes. So national sovereignty promises us that with it, once we achieve it, we will become a quote unquote community of equals. We will have self-determination, we will be decolonized, we will have equality. My book demonstrates that none of this actually materializes once national sovereignty is gained. And instead, I argue that nationalisms, both from above as well as from below, have actually worked to contain and curtail our dreams of decolonization and our demands for social justice that animated and continue to animate anti-colonial struggles. So first, nationalisms promise that all citizens of the quote-unquote nation are an equal part of the national community. However, in no nation and at no time has this actually been true. We can see this very clearly in government responses to COVID-19. The order given to quote unquote shelter in place has exposed the enormous inequalities between citizens in any given state. Some people have the ability to safely stay at home with a continued flow of income, plenty of food and cleaning supplies, secure in the knowledge that they will have access to health care, especially an extended stay in hospital if needed. Many, however, and depending which nation state we're talking about, most people do not have this. We see this in the nation state of India, which every year celebrates the victory of its national liberation in 1947. After Prime Minister Narendra Modi issued a national lockdown with 4 hours notice on March 24th, day laborers and other workers were thrown onto the street to fend for themselves. They were given no transportation, no food, no water, no health care. And knowing that their family homes in villages hundreds of kilometers away were the only place they could actually shelter in place, they were forced to walk. As of the end of March 30th, at least 17 people that we know of, including 5 children, died in this forced march. Tellingly, these Indian citizens are now popularly referred to as quote unquote migrant workers. Perhaps this makes it easier for some to see them as less worthy of support and as disposable. In Canada, which unlike the United States has a public healthcare system, not only are there people without healthcare coverage, such as undocumented migrants and many houseless people unable to prove their residency, but people who live in the north or live in rural places also do not have access to good quality healthcare, especially hospital care. Prisoners, of course, are locked in conditions that pretty much ensure the spread of COVID-19 like wildfire, and that is precisely what is taking place. In the midst of another deadly virus, one for which every nation state across the world has failed to properly prepare for, where there are insufficient numbers of test kits, hospital beds, ventilators, healthcare workers, and personal protective equipment for all of those workers who have been deemed essential, we know full well that as the number of people needing a hospital bed and, God forbid, a ventilator grows, that a hierarchy of whose life is worth more or whose life is worth less will determine who lives and who will be left for dead. We already see this happening in Italy and in Spain, where older people in nursing homes, all supposed members of the nation, are abandoned to die. Of course, once they're dead, they will be celebrated as heroes of the nation. In each of these tiny glimpses into the lives of people facing COVID-19, we see that nationalism doesn't even work for its citizens. While nationalists may want to ignore the class, gendered, racialized hierarchies that exist in any nation state and within any nation currently struggling for its quote unquote own national sovereignty, these hierarchies define people's lives and they determine who lives and who dies. Not every citizen is part of the national community. For instance, on March the 14th this year, a 19-year-old man stabbed 3 Asian American family members, including a 2-year-old and a 6-year-old in a Sam's Club in Texas. The suspect stated that he stabbed the family because he thought they were quote unquote Chinese and infecting people with the coronavirus. Their U.S. citizenship did nothing to change their attackers' view of them as a quote unquote foreign threat. Long before COVID-19, we knew that in no nation state in the world did women have the same earning power as men. We knew of the racialized wage gap. We knew that negatively racialized citizens are disproportionately captured by the prison industrial complex. They live in neighborhoods with the highest levels of toxins, have the highest rates of unemployment and houselessness, and work in the 3D jobs, dirty, dangerous, and denigrated. This is true in the rich world, and it is true in the poor world where 80% of all people live. Contemporary struggles for national sovereignty evidence these inequalities. In this book, I discuss, for example, how struggles for national sovereignty that employ the language of indigeneity or autochthony reflect, in many important ways, the existing practices of already recognized nationally sovereign states. And this is particularly the case in regards to membership of the nation. Who gets citizenship? Under international law, nation states have the right to determine their rules of membership. National sovereigns get to decide who will and will not be granted citizenship. This right to determine membership is also what is demanded by national sovereignty movements centering indigeneity. And in the book, I discuss 2 of the better known examples of this: the Mohawk Nation's efforts to implement a quote unquote marry out, get out rule, as well as the attempted expulsion of Black Cherokee freedmen from the Cherokee Nation. Both of these examples show that contemporary national liberation struggles are caught in a similar cycle of exclusionary practices. And just like the wealthiest and most powerful nation states argue that they must exclude, quote unquote, foreigners for the well-being of their national citizens, exclusions enacted by the Mohawks and the Cherokees are also justified on the basis that exclusion is necessary because of the scarcity of the nation's resources. Now, nation states have engaged in processes of culling since they first came onto the scene in the mid to late 19th century, and they have been culling ever since. In just the past decades alone, we have seen mass exclusions, expulsions, and even exterminations carried out in the name of preserving the nation for what I call its national natives. In the so-called national liberation states, to borrow a term from Vijay Prashad, millions of people have been culled from the roles of national citizens and millions have been massacred. In Rwanda in 1994, Tutsis, who were defined as quote unquote invading colonizers by Hutus who saw themselves as natives of the Rwandan nation, massacred over 800,000 Tutsis, along with so-called traitorous Hutus who refused to participate in the genocide. This discourse of indigeneity or autochthony also frames what many have called the world's next genocide in Myanmar, formerly Burma. People identified as Rohingya have had their Myanmar citizenship taken away from them. Their homes have been burned. Many have been placed in concentration camps, and hundreds of thousands of Rohingya have been forced to get out of Myanmar territory. A leading proponent of this national culling is a Buddhist monk named Asin Weerasethoo, who argues that it is simply impossible for quote unquote native Burmese to live with Rohingyas who have been popularly reclassified as Muslim migrants. We see the discourse of autochthony not only in the former colonies, but also in the former metropoles of previously existing global empires. The far right in Europe, for instance, now represents itself as defenders of the native or indigenous people of Europe. This is, of course, incredibly weird and uncanny, since native was initially an imperial state category that encompassed all of those people around the world that were colonized by European empires. To be native was to be a colonized person. To be European, on the other hand, was to be above natives. So this has now been retooled to serve nationalist purposes. Europeans increasingly call themselves natives to justify their nationalist exclusion of those they call invading migrants. That the language of indigeneity is the one that is used signals the growing moral authority of autochthonous discourses in politics. Evidently, Europeanness and whiteness are no longer enough to lay exclusive claims to national territories. Now, one also needs to be a native of Europe. For instance, in 2017, the National Front in France ran under the autochthonous slogan, First French. Its leader, Marine Le Pen, speaking at a rally in Marseille, promised a moratorium on immigration as a response to, quote, interlopers from all over the world who come and install themselves in our home, unquote. She declared she would make France more French and allow, quote, the owner to decide who can come in, unquote. The crowd of about 5,000 people roared its approval and chanted, quote, this is our home, unquote. She won almost 34% of the national vote. Secondly, nationalisms fundamentally fail to acknowledge the global scale and scope of society. Now, Margaret Thatcher was indeed wrong, as she often was, when she proclaimed that, quote, there is no such thing as society, only individuals and families, unquote. But nationalists who also conflate society with nation and its sovereignty, and who only see national solutions to global problems like COVID-19, are also wrong. While it's crucial that we have income relief, hospital beds, and ventilators, to argue these things for citizens alone is not enough. In fact, it's murderous. We live in a world that is deeply and intimately connected. A growing number of us depend on networks of support that traverse numerous nation states. with income earners, friends, and other loved ones stretched out across the world. And most of us are deeply reliant on people outside of national boundaries for our food, clothes, and our medicine, and so on. Moreover, within any national territory, there live people legally categorized as foreigners, as migrants, and their labor disproportionately produces much of our food, provides healthcare to hospital and nursing home patients, keeps hospitals, schools, and other workplaces clean, takes care of our children. With COVID-19, and for the first time in US history, farm workers, half of whom are undocumented, have been officially declared essential workers. Without their labor, there would be no fruits, vegetables, or dairy products in the stores. While deemed essential, however, many of them cannot visit a doctor or hospital themselves in fear of being captured, detained, and deported by immigration agents who have also been labeled essential workers. Farm workers are essential, but are not deemed worthy to receive any part of the $2 trillion bailout and relief package adopted by Congress. So we live in a world where migrants exist and are needed within nation states, but always on the terms set by nationalists and always under the threat of deportation. Another urgent reason to unmask the lie that society is national is because national responses will not help us with this global pandemic. It is not a national problem. Instead, the COVID-19 arose from a thorough intermeshing of the microbiological, the household, the local, the national, and the global scale and processes. Specifically, COVID-19 is a highly predictable and highly predicted result of the rapacious global system of capital accumulation. New viruses breed and they spread because of the penetration of capital, deep forest ecosystems, the expansion of industrial agriculture, and the creation of industrial meat farms. It's also a result of the organization of a global supply chain reliant on our dispossession from the earth, so that we are forced to buy the commodities we are sold. To end global pandemics, we need to end capitalism. But to do that, I think we need far better strategies for liberation than national sovereignty movements have provided us. Recognizing that society exists at the planetary level would allow us to engage in practices that correspond with our deep connection to one another. So, for instance, we can build global infrastructures of support and solidarity. Failure to support people across the world, each of whom is captured by one or another nation state, ensures the spread of the virus. For example, COVID-19 has come to the people living in the National Liberation State of the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC. The DRC's battled healthcare system is massively ill-equipped and underfunded to deal with COVID-19. The DRC government spends only 6% of its annual budget on healthcare, while the rest is spent on either enriching an already engorged ruling class or buying weapons to be used to keep that class in power. A national response in the DRC will result in mass deaths, and we cannot allow that to happen. Neither must we disavow all the reasons people have to continue to move during an age of pandemics. People continue to flee war. There has been no moratorium on war or poverty or persecution. People come for the possibility of an income, for a chance at healthcare, to be with their loved ones. We should listen to what public healthcare experts universally agree, that what we ought to be doing instead of shutting down borders is to continuously and properly screen all people, regardless of whether they are nationals or migrants, and refer them to healthcare. The third lie that nationalists tell us is that sovereignty will protect us, that it will bring about decolonization and self-determination, that it will finally give us the power to fight inequalities and gross imbalances of power. But as I discuss in my book, sovereignty is perhaps the biggest lie of all. No nation exists in isolation. Every nation state exists in a world of nation states. Each nation and nation state is dependent on globally operative markets for finance, commodity production, and labor. The rules of what I call in this book the post-colonial New World Order were obviously set by the most powerful nation states, especially the United States, at the end of World War II. So yes, of course, the world of nation states is not an equal or even one. As I discuss in my book, however, the United States was a champion of national self-determination. The US saw the end of imperial states and their replacement with national sovereigns as necessary for securing its world hegemony, which it did through the establishment of the United Nations and the Bretton Woods institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. This world of national sovereigns, formed in the decades after World War II, led to the expansion of global capitalism to every corner of our planet. More and more of life, more land, food, medicine, more water, air, and more of our labor has been captured by capitalist markets, markets regulated and protected by national sovereigns. There has been no even distribution of wealth or power, peace, or prestige. Far from it. Disparities in the post-colonial New World Order are only worsening. Again, proving the lie that nationalism is a community, that the nation is a community of equals, we see that the majority of the $4.4 trillion held in offshore tax havens is owned by nationals of the so-called national liberation states. For example, in 2014, 22% of the wealth of Latin American nationals was held in tax havens, and about 30% of the wealth of various African nationals. In other words, the material basis for the post-colonial New World Order of nation states has not fundamentally diverged from the previous imperial world order. And as I discuss in my book, while national sovereignty promised colonized people that it would resolve and reverse the gross inequalities and harms caused by imperialism, it obviously did not do that. And I argue that structurally it could not do that. It was incapable of doing that. Whatever nation states formed from previous imperial colonies are, they are not decolonized. Instead, national liberation has worked to contain the dreams and the demands of anti-colonial struggles. And that nation states did so in a way that delivered even more of us to capitalist predations. So to conclude, it's not at all surprising that people who are not recognized as a people with a capital P in the places where they actually live and work are the targets of national sovereigns. The worldview that every people with a capital P has their own place is what animates the violence against migrants. National sovereignty encourages those people who can make themselves into a people to see themselves as the people of a place, while migrants are seen as the people who are out of place. I show in this book that the post-colonial New World Order not only produces but also normalizes a racism in which political separations and segregations are seen as the natural spatial order of nationally sovereign states. Home has been assumed everywhere to be one's bounded nationality. By holding up national self-determination as the ultimate political goal, we ensure violence against those imagined as being from someplace else. Everywhere, those categorized as migrants are portrayed as inherently unworthy of land, of livelihoods, and of rights. Now, national politics are hardening. Just when more people are moving across the planet, nationalisms across the world and across the left-right political spectrum are redefining people's movements as nothing short of a colonial invasion. We are indeed in a crisis, but it is not a crisis caused by people moving. It is a crisis of violent expropriation and exploitation. A crisis, I argue in this book, of separation between people who together might be able to offer a profound challenge to the world order, but who for now remain separated. So I'll close in the way that I end this book by saying that whether or not our political demands and indeed our political horizons can surpass the structures organized by capital and by nation states will determine whether we live in a world of intensifying nationalisms and racisms, perhaps even fascisms, or whether we build a common world for all, a world where mobility is seen as a part of life and not against life itself. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Nandita, for that. I would now like to welcome Joseph Nevins to our conversation. Joseph Nevins teaches geography at Vassar College in New York. Among his books are Dying to Live, A Story of U.S. Immigration in an Age of Global Apartheid, Operation Gatekeeper and Beyond, of California Press. Joseph, welcome to the conversation with Nandita.
Well, thank you. And let me open by thanking Nandita for inviting me to comment on this book, which forced me to read it, something I'm very glad that I did. I thank you, Anju, and Another Story Bookshop for organizing and hosting the event. And thank you to Michael Rancic for helping with setting up the video conference. Many years ago, I read a book that made a big impact on me. It came out in 1992. It was called The White Man's Burden, The Curse of the Nation State in Africa. It was written by the late, great Africanist historian Basil Davidson. The book was published while horrific violence was unfolding in Sierra Leone and Liberia in the form of civil wars, among elsewhere on the African continent. Now, it's been a while since I read the book, but my recollection is that Davidson argued that what explained these wars, in addition to myriad other failings of post-colonial African countries, was the fact that African states, or that African elites, did not look to their own pre-colonial practices and non-European ways of seeing and being, and instead replicated them, thus laying the foundation for horrific violence and injustice. The book ends in the former Yugoslavia and the wars that were unfolding at that time there, thus suggesting that what Davidson was calling the black man's burden and the nation-state curse is our common burden. Home Rule is a tremendous book that makes a somewhat reminiscent, but also a very different argument. It's wide-ranging across time and space, taking the reader from Cameroon to Mexico, Canada and Bolivia, to Mauritius in the United States, Australia, and South Africa, and a lot of places in between. It does many things. One is that it helps us to understand the relationship between the creation of Western empires and the production of mobility and immobility, and relatedly, different categories of people, those who belong to a space and those who don't. Another is that it also helps us to see how the successor political geography of empire, independent nation states, have built upon those different forms of mobility and immobility and the associated categories to institutionalize the association of people with places in a form of policed and thus violent belonging and non-belonging. In doing so, the book makes makes a number of provocative arguments, but one very provocative argument in particular, let me highlight here. While asserting that the very category of native is something that is constructed, Nandita is very careful to distinguish between a nativism of the relatively powerful and privileged and a nativism of the dispossessed and disadvantaged. There are huge differences between quote unquote natives who champion a Europe or United States, for example, for white people, and Aboriginal, Native, or First Nation peoples who are concerned with the well-being of a historically and contemporarily persecuted group of people and or stewardship of the biosphere. Yet, Nandita wants to insist that these projects, both based on claims of who is native and who is not, share much. And one thing they share is a notion of time, that those who were here first, right, real or imagined, whether that firstness is based on some sort of origin myth or a civilizing project, are the ones who should call the shots over the territory and the people within it that they claim. Now, such a claim is inherently political, but it can also have a depoliticizing effect. At least that's the hope of those advocating the position. And what I mean by this is that if one accepts that those who were here or there first are the ultimate owners, there's really nothing to talk about or debate. Okay? And if one accepts this, it effectively means that our job, the job of those who aren't part of this first group, is to follow the leader, right? Or the owner. In other words, our job is not to engage in politics, to struggle or debate, or advocate for something different, even if it were better than what those who position themselves as the natives, the owners, are calling for. Another thing they share in terms of the work they do, at least in terms of how they're imagined today in a world of nation states and their territorial boundaries, is that they're predicated, as Nandita just explained, on inclusion and exclusion. This both invites and necessitates violence of various forms, and as Nandita shows in the book, the violence is all too often of horrific proportions. Finally, in a grossly unequal world, in a world created by global empires inextricably tied to capitalism, the division of global space into nominally discrete peoples and places undermines our ability to take on capital, among other border-transcending phenomena and processes. It's hardly a coincidence, Nandita argues, that the inequities within countries, and particularly between countries, is far greater today than it was in the age of formal colonialism. This raises the question of what a true decolonization would look like. Those championing decolonization, particularly of a third worldist variety, desired an end to exploitation, oppression, and subjugation. They wanted freedom, bread, and roses. As Nandita shows, the promise of national self-determination has not been realized. And this is not a problem of implementation. It speaks to the very limits of the ways in which we've imagined liberation. In Nandita's first book, Home Economics, Nationalism, and the Making of Migrant Workers, quote unquote, in Canada, she talks about and decries what she calls, and I'm quoting her here, the territorialization of people's consciousness. She uses the same phrase in Home Rule. That territorialization and the accompanying spatial imaginary is specifically a nation-state-based one. In other words, it's based on hard, violent borders. It's a consciousness and spatial imaginary that, rather than being a vehicle to liberation, it's become a political geographical prison, not only for those defined as migrants and outsiders, but also for those of us defined as belonging, as citizens. This intellectual prison leads us to focus on a particular means to liberation, nation-statism, despite that means being both a roadmap to repeated failure in so many cases, and despite that means necessarily involving violence against those defined as outside the national tribe. In this regard, the book's an invitation to imagine a different world, a world of far-reaching decolonization. This entails, Nandita envisions, a world beyond nation-state borders and their violence, and beyond a capitalism facilitated by those nation-states and the differences they produce and exacerbate. Now, one can easily imagine someone dismissing the book as overly ambitious, as trying to push things too far. This, of course, is a frequent response to radical thinkers. When I say radical here, I mean in terms of people who try to get to the root of a problem. It makes me recall a debate that took place in the mid-1950s between William Faulkner, the great writer, and another great writer, James Baldwin. Both of them were opposed to Jim Crow, institutionalized racism in the United States, but Faulkner was afraid that if we pushed too hard in the fight against Jim Crow, we would lose what he saw as the good things about the U.S. South. Baldwin didn't want to play ball in that regard, and so he wrote this very fiery response to Faulkner in a publication that was called the Partisan Review in 1956. And I want to quote Baldwin here, what he says in response to Faulkner. Any real change implies the breakup of the world as one has always known it. The loss of all that gave one an identity, the end of safety. And at such a moment, unable to see and not daring to imagine what the future will now bring, one clings to what one knew, or thought one knew, to what one possessed or dreamt that one possessed. Yet it is when a man is able, without bitterness or self-pity, to surrender a dream he has long cherished, or a privilege he had long possessed, that he is set free. He has set himself free for higher dreams, for greater privileges, end quote. So let me end. I have lots of questions for Nandita, but let me end my comments by saying first, Thank you to Nandita for your great effort to help us reach for higher dreams, for greater privileges, not just for some, but for all.
Thank you, Joseph. I really appreciate your comments. I've long admired your own work on borders and the subjugation of people through state categories like citizen and migrant. So I'm so glad to have you have read the book. Thank you just for that. And thank you for engaging with me. I thought maybe we could start. I just had one comment, and then maybe if I could hear your questions. It was about Basil Davidson and that book about the Black man's burden. I'm glad that you distinguished between his work and mine, because I think that, of course, there is perhaps some similarity at a perhaps a superficial level, that we both agree that the nation state is a problem. But I think Basil Davidson didn't go far enough. He first of all was highly romanticized pre-colonial societies, which I think is a problem in many parts of the world, particularly when people are looking for particularly looking for sovereigns, pre-colonial sovereigns, real or imagined. It seems that this imagination of national sovereignty weighs so heavily on our heads that even when we look to the past, we only see a long string of sovereigns before, so we imagine that we were always sovereign, that was what we were. We always had, in the African context, kings and empires and et cetera. And so I think he was really off the mark on that one. But also, I think the problem of the nation state far surpasses that idea that the national elite have somehow hijacked the project of decolonization. And actually, we need to look at the structural conditions of nation state power and its relationship, particularly to global capitalism, to show that it is incapable of producing anything like decolonization. So thank you for bringing back Basil Davidson into this discussion.
Yeah, it's been a it's been a long time since I read the book, and I didn't have the advantage of going back to reading it because it's in my office and we're all locked down. But yeah, that's what you say strikes me as quite accurate. And I'm not an Africanist, so I can't really comment on his romanticization, but it does certainly read somewhat romantic, right? And as I recall, he doesn't really talk about capitalism, right? But I think that sort of the inherent violence of the nation state system, again, he ends in the former Yugoslavia, right, is something that concerns him. And that's where I saw some overlap, right? The sort of the simple us and them and what that leads to, right? And in terms of, sort of your politics and your analysis, one of the things, that's really struck me about the book, in some ways, it was the thing I was most moved by. And it's so simple, but it was your acknowledgments. Right? And that you open, if I recall correctly, by talking about your mother. Right? And I wonder if you could just say a little more about that. Why, how your mother's experiences and your experiences with your mother led you to your politics, to your intellectual positions, in your broad thinking about sort of global political geography and their associated the ideas associated with that. Your mic's off.
One story about geography, about political geography that always resonates with me from my mom is I had once pulled out an atlas that my father had bought me, and I was looking at India, and I was looking, asking her, oh, where were you born? Let me see if I can find your village. And she was born in a village named Ropar in Punjab. And I was looking, and I was like, oh, I found it here. You were born here. And she said, oh, is that East India? And I said, no, that's North India, right? And so I realized that, she wasn't operating on that same kind of spatial imagination that we get from atlases about north, south, east, west. And I said, no, this is North India. How could you think this is East India, being an arrogant little shithead teenager? And she said, well, why do they call us East Indians then, if that's not East India? And it really struck me that my mother was a very kind person. And I think that she couldn't imagine that people were just like East Indian was some kind of, was a false way of defining her. She presumed that people must know something about her, and that she must actually be from Eastern India. So my mother and our experiences together, my mother was born a British subject, a native of British India. She shifted to becoming a national of the National Liberation State of India in 1947. Then when we moved to Canada, she became an immigrant, a permanent resident. And then she and I, shortly after that, became Canadian citizens. And all that time, she was still my mother. But in terms of how she was able to live her life and how she experienced every part of her life, whether it was the labor market, whether it was her access to dignity and, being treated like a fellow person in society, all changed depending on what category she was in. And so it's always struck me that it's important to pay attention to how we categorize people and to not conflate that category with who they actually are. They're much more than their categories. And those categories are mechanisms of control and containment that serve something far outside of that person, and usually in order to subjugate them.
Could those categories also be foundations for liberation? Or are you talking about specifically sort of nation state imposed categories or categories in general? Am I making sense?
I think that, there's definitely a broader discussion to be had here in terms of whether any of the subjectivities or self-identities that we have today are anything but imposed. It's really hard to imagine, I'm thinking now as I'm talking about my mother, I'm using the category mother to define her. Obviously, she was much more than my mother. So, I think that there's a larger discussion to be had here about any of these identities, and our rage to identify ourselves as well as others, I think also needs to be properly historicized and politically challenged. But especially nation state categories, especially nation state categories, because they come with the full force of the violence of the state behind them, are particularly consequential.
So part of your effort in this book, as I said, is the way I understand it, is you want us to push, to struggle for a sort of a far-reaching decolonization. And you make pretty clear in a lot of ways what you mean by decolonization, right? What we need to do to achieve a better world. What I didn't see in the book, and perhaps I missed this, is any sort of explicit explanation of what constitutes colonization. I sort of inferred it by default. And what I infer from the book is that you understand colonization to mean unjust relationships with their origins in Western empire building and capitalism, relations that live on in the supposedly post-colonial world. Is that what you mean, or were you trying to get at something else?
I was actually trying to get at something else, and you very perceptively have gotten to the heart of what I was most dissatisfied with the book. The book that I, am now working on, and that this book, Home Rule, I actually see as part of a larger project, is really thinking through what we mean by colonization and questioning whether how we define colonialism actually makes any sense. If you look at most political dictionaries of colonialism, what's colonialism? you will always see that it's defined as foreign rule, right? So there's something about that qualification of ruling projects by qualifying it with foreign rule that has kind of animated what we think of as colonialism, and therefore what we think of as anti-colonialism. So anti-colonialism, because colonialism is defined as foreign rule, anti-colonialism becomes getting rid of the foreigner, all right? Getting rid of foreign rule, having home rule, having self-rule, self-determination, right? And I think that's a problem. I think actually to have a really effective and radical project of decolonization, we do need to de-link colonialism from foreign rule. And that would, I think, force us to question, definitely, of course, we know historians have long told us that colonialism wasn't invented by European empires. It's part, there were empires, first of all, that weren't European, and long before there were ever, the last 500 plus years of these capitalist empires that we've had from Europe. But for example, I've been very, very interested in the social history of Europe, of the dispossessions from land of people in Europe, of their subjugation, of their criminalization, of the racism and the denigration that was leveled at them. And I've always wondered, why do we not see them as colonized people, like the people that the earliest capitalists in 16th century England threw off the land, criminalized them by calling them vagrants, putting them into poorhouses, forcing them into wage labor, at the best wage labor, if not, slave labor, if not convict labor, if not indentured labor. Why are they not part of the anti-colonial struggle, right? Why is colonialism not simply about rule, right? About being ruled over? Why isn't it about expropriation and exploitation writ large? Now, I can see some historians of colonialism shaking their heads and going, well, if colonialism is just about exploitation and expropriation, then everything's colonialism, right? Ever since there's been class rule, and ever since there's been states, which, James Scott has very well documented, are about only 5,000 years old, right? So a blip in human history. And I guess the key question I have for my current research is, if we cannot separate colonialism from foreign rule, and therefore decolonization from getting rid of the foreigner and enacting home rule, is this actually a useful concept for us, right? Or do we need something far more? Yeah, sorry.
I'm sorry, no, I interrupted you. I'm sorry. This being what? Just a clarification question.
I forget now what I said. Sorry, could you?
No, you say you were wondering if this is a useful concept. I'm saying this
colonialism.
Colonialism. Okay.
Whether colonialism is deep enough to capture the ruling practices that we need to oppose, right? Which is not to say that there wasn't colonialism. Of course, there was. Of course, people experienced something that we now call colonialism. Right. And of course, that was an incredibly violent and murderous project. And of course, it enriched some people beyond imagination. And of course, the legacies of it still live with us today. But if we can only see ruling practices as problematic when the ruler is not, quote unquote, one of us, then I think we are going to continuously be trapped in those relationships of and practices of expropriation and exploitation, and that's not good enough.
Absolutely. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. And so, at the same time, I'm wondering when a process of unjust rule is exercised by people who see themselves as different from the people that they're ruling over, and see the place from where they come as distinct from the place they're ruling over. How do we engage in struggle? So let me be more specific. So, what do you have to say to people like, who are in West Bank and Gaza and Palestine? To the people in the Western Sahara, the Sahrawi people, or the people in West Papua, right, struggling against occupations by nation states that they don't want to be part of, right? That's not their national liberation struggle, right? And in a world of nation states, right, what options do they have other than trying to create their own? Right? Like there's no roadmap, there's no category, at least in terms of legal political geography, if you will, internationally, that allows for that. What strategies should they pursue in light of the truly decolonized world that you envision? And I'm not asking you to solve all the world's problems, but I'm just trying to think, help us to think this through, because these are really practical issues, right? Is if you're sitting there in Gaza and you're under lockdown, right? You're under a longstanding blockade, and there's no chance that you can become Israeli, even if that were desirable, right? It's not allowed. You're othered. You're. So what do you have to say to people who identify with those parts of the world or their allies?
Yeah, that is a seriously important question. I guess first I would say, let's join together in a common struggle to end practices of expropriation, right, where our lands are taken away and we are left with nothing except our labor to try and survive, right, in a capitalist marketplace where everything has been placed in the market, everything we need, food, medicine, shelter, etc. But I would say that, my grandparents were part of the national liberation struggle in India. And certainly that shaped both of my parents' lives in a very significant way. And what they fought for, both my grandparents lived the majority of their lives under British imperial rule in India. And they experienced day in and out the exploitation, the incredible exploitation of labor, the famines that resulted from the growing of cash crops in British India, the incredible violence that was done to anyone who resisted the empire. And the day-to-day banal racism that made them seem as less than everybody, less than certainly the rulers. And they held out the hope, right, that once Indians rule themselves, none of this will happen, right? We wouldn't do that to each other, they presumed, right? But look at India today, 70 plus years after national liberation. It is worse. Like the experience, the disparities between rich and poor in India today are worse than they were under empire. Right? The lives of people who are, the lives of a large number of people in India are not dissimilar from the lives of people in the Gaza Strip, other than the fact that supposedly those people in India have, quote unquote, their own national sovereignty. So what I would say is, I hope that this book can serve as a cautionary tale to this isn't the project that we need to pin our hopes on. Now, I absolutely agree with your second point, which is that this is the structure that, it's the one way, the promise of the post-colonial New World Order was that if you could organize yourself into a nation, you could have self-determination, right? That's the charter, the founding charter of the United Nations, that all people have a right to self-determination. So shortly after that, and also long before that, people were rapidly, trying to organize themselves into nations. And there's more new nations now than there were 70 years ago, right? And more people have organized themselves into nation if they can. Not all people can. right? So I'm thinking of the Black Lives Matter movement in North America, right, in Canada and the United States, that there are lots of people who are not happy with the nation state that they live in, but cannot organize themselves into a nation, cannot demand national self-determination. So the lesson being that getting sovereignty doesn't solve your problems. And if sovereignty isn't the only way out of the mess, how can we together work to figure out another system? Because if we say, well, these are the structures that we are forced into, then how is the project radical? If the project is to fit into an existing structure of rule, never mind one that's been shown to fail colonized people, but if the project is a radical one, it is to find new ways of organizing our lives. And for me, the project is one of the commons, right? It is about building a commons at a global scale, and ensuring that the basis of life in the commons is not based on either private property rights or citizenship rights, both of which are fundamentally pivot on exclusion, but on the right to not be excluded. What do we do with one another on this planet if none of us can actually be excluded from enjoying the treasures of the earth? What happens then, right?
I mean, that's a great question, and it's an exciting prospect to try to envision and struggle for, right? And so, one question I have in relation to that is, how can we? I have no problem with what you're putting forth there. That makes a lot of sense to me. And at the same time, we're not all the same, right? Difference is part of who we are. Right? And that, there are social differences, there are, all sorts of types of differences, but one of those differences is geographical in terms of we have different relationships to places, right? And they help to define who we are, how we see ourselves as individuals, as part of particular communities or whatever. And so, some people, and just as places differ, people do. Some people share more than others, partially because of their ties to places. Right? So, what is a good, just relationship to place? Right? What might a non-oppressive, emancipatory politics that shows respect for difference and different relationships to place look like? And that's, that allows for, not only allows for, but flows from this vision of a global commons. Again, I said I'm not asking you to solve all the world's problems, but I guess I am in some ways. But
yeah, I think that, let me just start by saying that no other project has been more violent about enforcing homogeneity than the nation state,
right.
than nationalism, right? Speak the national language, follow the quote unquote national culture, so on and so forth. Many, many scholars have written about how one or another nation has been formed through incredibly violent processes. And secondly, I would argue that perhaps one of the reasons that scholarship on migration and migrants themselves are so disturbing to nationalists is because the recognition that you can have multiple places, right? That you can actually have a very, very deep relationship to place, to multiple places. Right. And you can also have a very deeply ambivalent or very destructive relationship to place that you're desperate to get out of. Right. Mm-hmm. So not to romanticize home. Right. I think migrants and migration scholars bring that out in a way that makes nationalists very, very uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. So I think that the only just relationship to me to place is one that doesn't abstract place into something called territory, right? Territory is something that is controlled by sovereigns or by states, right? Territory and land couldn't be further apart. Land is what keeps us alive. Land being, a placeholder for the earth that we live on. So that the land, the water, the air, the other living beings on that planet. That is what we need to have respect for. And I think the only respectful way to live on the planet is to make sure that no one is excluded from enjoying the treasures of that earth, right? And to not abstract that into, this is my territory, it's not your territory. And because it's my territory, I get to tell you what to do on it. I get to tell you what language to speak. I get to tell you who you can marry or not marry, or et cetera, et cetera. So I think that we do, right now, land has been so conflated with territory that we're not actually even talking about the same thing anymore.
Right. I think you make a very important point that is often forgotten, right? That the creation of these these national communities is inherently a violent process, right? This process of homogeneity. It's assumed to be natural, and to the extent that it's acknowledged that there are these violences, right? The nation statist response is ever more national homes, right? And it's an endless process, right?
And it's a process that we can see in like either the dissolution of current nation states or the creation of new nation states, right? Like there's always this expanding and contracting feature of that political geography of nation states, right? You always have new states forming, you have old states falling apart, new national liberation struggles. Some get their sovereignty, and then that breeds other national liberation struggles, and on it goes.
Going back to my question, and I'm realizing as you're talking, it's sort of an unfair question about what do you say to West Papuans or, Palestinians? It puts the onus on them. And what you're showing in the book is that this is really, the onus is on all of us, right? This has to be a global struggle. And to the extent that we want to allow or, facilitate, assist, be in solidarity with Palestinians or West Papuans or whoever, right? It's not enough to focus on what is defined as the particulars of their struggle, right? If they're going to have the space to really imagine a far-reaching liberation, right, that struggle has to take place everywhere. Does that seem?
Yeah, I mean, I think that for lack of a better term, we need a new internationalism, right? Because the forces that we're contending with are not national forces, right?
Or do we need a new globalism? I mean, because internationalism still has the term national in it, right? I mean, we can, or new forms of difference, and new political geographical expressions of that, or something like that, right?
Yeah, planetary solidarity of the producers of wealth.
So, do you see, in terms of your analysis of capitalism? I mean, basically, you're making a two-pronged argument, right? We have to get rid of the nation state. We have to get rid of capitalism. Can we get rid of the nation state without getting rid of capitalism? I guess partly what I'm asking here is is the nation state? I mean, I think you make a persuasive argument that the nation state facilitates the interests of capital, right? Could capitalism exist without the nation state, in your estimation?
Yes, absolutely. Definitely. I mean, capitalism existed before the nation state.
Oh, there you go. Right.
Right. It existed before the existence of European empires. Capitalism emerged in the 16th century in the English countryside, which was governed by a monarchical state. Right. It shifted quickly into an imperial state. And other empires also incorporated capitalist social relationships into their imperial practices, like the Spanish and the Portuguese, for example. So yes, we could have a world without nation states and still have capitalism, which is why the project of challenging the nation state for me has to always be part of critiquing the nation state as incapable of producing anything called self-determination or liberation, for me, is part of the broader project of showing that despite the rhetoric of nation states, we still live in a world dominated by a very much globally operative capitalism.
And by weakening or eliminating nation states, you see that fight against capitalism being potentially more effective because we're getting rid of the obfuscations, if you will, that prevent us from seeing those relationships, those forms of, those constellations of power that transcend nation states. Is that what you're saying?
I think yes, because I think that nationalism, unlike imperialism, nationalism in particular is founded on the idea of a community that transcends class, right? So in the nation, you can have all of these hierarchies with no disruption to the existence of the nation, to no disruption of the fantasy of a community of equals, right? So nationalism is particularly dangerous, I believe, because it promises a very, very false sense of commonality, of a commonality that is based on something that is beneficial to rulers, and always to the detriment of those that they're ruling over. But that, nationalism pretends that the rulers and the people that they rule over are the same, right? The same people, in fact, right? We're all one nation. And that's when, to me, that idea that the nation is a cross-class community is what depoliticizes nationalist struggles, right? It depoliticizes because it cannot account for all of the hierarchies that the existence of global capitalism, for instance, depends upon, right? The hierarchies, first and foremost, of class, but also of racism, sexism, et cetera, right? So I'm starting to ramble now, so I'll try and wrap this up. But I do think nationalism is particularly nefarious and dangerous precisely because of that notion of a cross-class community, and therefore is particularly necessary to challenge if we have any hope of challenging capitalism.
Thank you. Trying to speak. Okay.
Thank you, Nandita, and thank you, Joe, so much for that conversation. We're going to open it up to questions from the audience. We've got quite a vibrant discussion happening on our YouTube channel, and I'm going to bring in some questions. But first of all, Joseph, thank you so much for that engagement and for that conversation. It was really fascinating. Thank you, Nandita, as always, for your very detailed, measured, intense responses. I think the audience who will be watching this, and this is going to be permanently recorded and put on our YouTube channel for the future, will have a lot to engage with. So thank you both for that. And I'd like to open the questions from the audience with sort of picking up from where you both left off to a question by Iganza, wondering about any thoughts Nandita has on the popularity of nationalist leftism, such as embodied in Angela Nagel's atrocious article, The Left Case Against Open Borders.
Yes, and I would very much welcome Joe in terms of chiming in anytime you feel that you want to help answer these questions. Left nationalism, isn't that term left nationalism the clearest indicators that nationalism has completely colonized our imaginations, right? Like, the left for me is the basis of fighting against deep structures of inequality and exploitation. how do you then say that you're a nationalist if you're part of the left, right? The nation, and nation states are clearly, as we can see in the COVID-19 emergency, clearly incapable of meeting the needs of the people that live inside the nation states, whether they're categorized as citizens or as migrants. And they're clearly part of the global structures of scarcity and exploitation, as we can see in the fight for the vaccine, right? Can you imagine what the world is going to look like once one particular national government claims to have control over the vaccine, and what it's going to do to others who don't have access to it, right? So to me, left nationalism is a complete oxymoron, and I reject it as anything to do with the left. And to argue for a world of borders, I mean, come on, like, how can a world of borders do anything but facilitate the processes of dispossession and exploitation, right? We know that a world of borders doesn't stop people from moving. I mean, it does kill a lot of people that try and move. It harms a lot of people that try and move. It exploits a lot of people who try and move, but people are moving. And arguably, nation states want people to move into their territories. And the less rights they have once they're living in their territories, the better off they are, right? We know that there's a huge wage gap between workers with citizenship status and immigration statuses, and an enormous shift between people with permanent residency status and people who have been classified as undocumented, right? So a world of borders actually is a boon to capital. It's a boon to people who want to profit from that labor, and it creates more competition and less solidarity in the labor market. So borders are the first thing, as far as I'm concerned, that we need to get rid of.
Yeah. Following from that, a question from Melo Raga, actually a two-pronged question. Does sovereignty always have to be used in conjunction with nation and nation state? Can there be resistance for sovereignty of a certain place without it being tied to nation state? And then the second part, and I can repeat it after we do the first part if you'd like, is, are nation states fundamentally a project of white supremacy and anti-Blackness? How does global race making play a role in this argument?
So again, there have been sovereigns before there were nation states. And it's again also imaginable that there will be other kinds of sovereigns, even if the nation form of state power is dismantled, right? One of the things that I try and do in this book is distinguish between different forms that state power can take, and particularly in their relationship to governing people's movements, freedom of movement. So imperial states have a particular way of imagining people's movements. Nation states have an imaginary of anti-immigration. So yes, you can imagine a world of sovereigns without nation states, but you cannot imagine a decolonized world with sovereigns, is something that I would very strongly argue for. So I don't think that you can separate out the struggle for, well, let me put it another way. I don't think that sovereignty is a left project. So if left nationalism is an oxymoron, a left struggle for sovereignty is perhaps maybe even tops that one, right? Like why would the left argue for sovereignty, right? I can see arguing for strategies to empower us to be able to resist anyone who wants to take away our land or anyone who wants to exploit our labor. But to do so in the name of having sovereignty over territory is only going to reproduce precisely the things that we're trying to get rid of. So I would never argue for sovereignty as a way out of dispossession and exploitation. Whether nation states is inherently about white supremacy and anti-Blackness, no, I don't think so. I think there is a great commonality, for instance, between Narendra Modi and Donald Trump, between Narendra Modi and Marine Le Pen, right? Between Le Pen and Duterte, between Bolsonaro and Nigel Farage, right? Like there is a deep commonality between people who want to use their sense of themselves as the standard bearers of the nation against all others. And so I don't think that nationalism is a particularly white supremacist project, although certainly it's very useful for white supremacists.
Thank you. Now we've got a question, again, tied to that from Charmaine. How do we understand sovereignty movements fighting colonization like in Canada?
So again, and I think Joseph, if you want to jump in here, please do. I see them again as movements that are trying to address some very, very fundamental issues that all of us should be paying attention to. We need to end dispossession. We need to end exploitation. We need to end the incredible disparities that exist between Indigenous peoples in Canada, for instance, and others. But I would argue that Indigenous sovereignty movements are movements that have been ushered in through what I've been calling the post-colonial New World Order, right? That they're movements that have limited the political horizon to one that argues for national sovereignty as a way to end dispossession and exploitation. And I think, again, I don't want to repeat myself, but I think that the evidence is in that no national liberation struggle has been able to achieve that. And I would argue is no national liberation struggle is structurally capable of achieving decolonization. So I think that Indigenous struggles in Canada, would be greatly strengthened with a move away from a struggle for sovereignty and a move towards a struggle for the commons. Now, I know many Indigenous scholars would disagree and have disagreed with that argument. There's a lot of Indigenous scholarship that's coming out opposed to the commons, who see the commons as just another imperial project. And I disagree. I think that it may feel like the commons is not a liberatory project, but I think that's precisely because the commons is not a territorial project. It's not a sovereignty project, right? It's a project in which we're not going to distinguish between who has the ability to, benefit from the abundance of the earth and who doesn't have that. And to me, that's a radical project. I don't quite understand why anyone would be opposed to that. Okay. I don't know, Joseph, if you want to also contribute to that.
No, you've said it quite well. I have nothing to add to that. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so moving on, we've got a question from Poonam in Toronto, veering the conversation away a little bit from this discussion around sovereignty, is how do you engage Fanon's pitfalls of national consciousness? Or do you engage Fanon's pitfalls of national consciousness? And if so, how? We need your volume.
Sorry. I don't directly engage with Fanon or Foucault. I was going to say Foucault there, sorry. I don't directly engage with Fanon, but of course, I appreciate his work. I would argue that his critique of national consciousness, and particularly his critique of how the national bourgeoisie would overtake the national liberation struggle for their own private profit, to be the most compelling part of his work, for sure. I would argue that Fanon doesn't go far enough. I think that Fanon warned us against the national bourgeoisie, but he still believed that the national liberation struggle could somehow exist without the bourgeoisie, right? And whether that bourgeoisie was national or more what is the case, global, was not really addressed by him. And I think that, Fanon was a person of his time, right? National liberation was the struggle at that time if you were living in the quote unquote third world. The so unlike many struggle national liberation movement activists, Fanon had a critique of the bourgeoisie, but again, I don't think that he adequately understood the global character of capitalism and how that global character of capitalism, particularly markets for finance, were going to undermine any national liberation struggle from the outset. Whether that national liberation struggle called itself socialist or whether it was a liberal project of capitalism. So we can see that in all of the failed national liberation struggles, not just in the ones that have an clearly defined national bourgeoisie.
Okay, and this one from Ian. How can this book respond to the claim that Third World Project is assassinated by the U.S. Western capital? In other words, would national liberation have turned out to be less violent?
Yeah, I think that's Vijay Prashad's argument, right? That the Third World Project was assassinated by Bretton Woods, for instance. I would say that in my book, I talk about how the United States championed national sovereignty movements of colonized people, right? Against the British Empire, against the French Empire, right? And I talk in particular about the Atlantic Charter, which was signed in 1941 between Churchill and Roosevelt. Roosevelt had Churchill over a barrel. And in exchange for the continued financial support of the United States during World War II, in 1941, at that time of the signing of the Atlantic Charter, the United States was not a formal party to World War II. So its promise of continued financial aid to a Britain that was undergoing the London Blitz, in a Europe in which France was occupied by the Nazis, was that after the end of World War II, the United States insisted that the British Empire give the right of national sovereignty to all people, right? So it was Roosevelt who championed national sovereignty, right? Not because Roosevelt was any kind of anti-colonial activist, far from it. The United States well understood that in order to become a world hegemon, which it did after World War II, it would require the dismantling of imperial economies, right? The empire was not just a political unit, it was an economic unit. And it was, for the most part, an economic unit that was protected by the imperial state. So it's not like capital from New York could go and simply invest in British Barbados or British India or British Mauritius without the approval of the British Empire. For the United States, for capital that is headquartered in the United States to penetrate those colonies had to become formally sovereign, right? So national sovereignty worked for the United States. The United States didn't assassinate national sovereignty. In part, the United States brought forward national sovereignty. What assassinated decolonization is global capitalism, regulated and supported militarily by national sovereigns. Definitely, the United States was on top of that heap, but the national liberation states played a large part in this as well. Like India, where I was born, has the largest military in Asia. that military is primarily used against its own citizens, right? So, to just simply say that the national liberation struggle failed because of the United States is far too easy, and lets global capitalism off the hook, and lets those other nation states like the national liberation states off the hook as well.
Thank you, Nandita. We're going to wrap it up after about 2 more questions. This is one from Harriet. Harriet says that Ostrom says key principle of commons is defining who has access and some non-hierarchical way of deciding how to regulate rights and obligations. I have been struggling with this. Please comment.
Yes, so thank you, Harriet Friedman. I really miss you, and I wish that I could see you in person. Ostrom is, a Nobel Prize. Did she win the Nobel Prize? Anyways, I think she won the Nobel Prize in economics for her work on the commons. The problem with Elinor Ostrom's work, and look at me, I'm critiquing Fanon and Ostrom and on, but the problem with Ostrom's work is that she's looking at commons historically, right? She's looking at commons, especially she's looking at commons that existed as parts of already existing class societies, right? So when we think of the commons in England, for instance, in the 16th century, this wasn't a world without classes. This wasn't a world without, gross hierarchies, particularly patriarchal hierarchies. So I don't think so when Ostrom says that the commons is about determining who gets access to the commons, defining who gets access to the commons, etc. Yes, this may be true in this small number of studies that we actually have of existing commons. Most of the history of commons is unrecorded, right? So we don't actually know the history of the commons as much as we need to, simply because arguably writing was a manifestation of state power, right? So how do you record things in the absence of state power is an important question for historians to answer. I think for me, what I take away from all the work that I've read about the commons is that the most important aspect of the commons was the right of personhood. Now, these terms, personhood, rights, etc., we need to problematize them as well. But for now, if we could just use them as shorthand, the right of personhood in the commons meant the right to not be excluded, right? That here is the river. I need some fish. No one has the authority, right, the legitimated power to prevent me from accessing what I need. Of course, there's been a lot of anti-commons work written by capitalists, proponents of capitalism, who argue about the quote-unquote tragedy of the commons, right? There's too many people are catching too many fish, destroying the commons. But to me, the fundamental political principle of the commons and the idea of politics in the commons is about the right to not be excluded. And I think I can't even really wrap my head around what it means to not have the right to exclude people, right? Because the two most fundamental bases of our world in relationship to rights are about exclusion, private property rights and citizenship rights. So how do we imagine a world where no one can actually be excluded from the wealth of the earth? So to me, the commons that I'm talking about is not something in the past. It's not about refashioning the past and reigniting past ways of doing things. We actually need a global commons, since that's the society that we live in today is globally operative. So that's never existed before. So I think it's up to us to reinvent the commons.
Yeah, I think it is. Okay, we're going to end now, bringing it back to what's happening in the world with Omar. In your view, what is unique about having virus as a threat compared to other nationally constructed threats?
Well, perhaps viruses, even more than human beings, cannot be stopped. Right? Human beings can be drowned and they can be shot at and they can be raped and they can be burned alive. Viruses, no. Right? So maybe there is a particular threat of viruses in the sense that you can't, the ability to control them lies outside of us. And it lies actually in other microbiological things called antibodies, right, that we need to produce. But viruses, like everything else, can fuse very nicely into existing political structures and fuse nicely into existing hierarchies. So viruses can be nationalized, they can be racialized, they can be nationalized, right? They can be made to be foreign threats. So I think that there's a lot of hope right now that our response to COVID-19 will usher in a better world, right? Where we make masks for one another, where we donate our time and energy to feeding one another, et cetera, et cetera. I'm much more concerned with how the virus is going to be weaponized to further already existing political projects. Who's going to be blamed for the virus is a big worry for me. And I think it's probably Trump's hoped for ticket to re-election, right? Is if I can just continue to deflect my own incompetence and my own lack of regard for human life onto Chinese people or the Chinese state or Chinese, quote unquote, Chinese capital, which is another oxymoron, then I can get my own way. And so viruses are a unique threat in some ways, but in other ways, they just capture the zeitgeist of the moment and push us further into a more xenophobic, possibly fascist future. And that, again, is what I hope my book is a cautionary tale against, that we need to fundamentally challenge who we think we are, and fundamentally challenge who we think everyone else is in this world, and somehow build a world for all of us.
And that is a wonderful way to close this online event. Thank you so much, Nandita Sharma, for your fascinating exploration and discussion. Thank you so much for writing Home Rule. I don't have a copy at home with me to put up. Joseph with it. Nandita, okay, let's get Joseph back on the screen and let's unblur that image of that beautiful cover, actually. Big thank you to all the folks at Duke University Press who continue to put out critical, engaging work. Thank you to Mike at Another Story Bookshop for doing all the tech, and a big thank you to Joe Nevins for being part of this conversation. We are stocking your books as well, Joe, at Another Story Bookshop, and we very much look forward to the day when our doors can be open again, and Nandita will be coming to Toronto, we hope, in October to give a live presentation from her work, and hopefully to Toronto, to New York, Joe, where she can give a presentation well. We hope you all are safe. We hope you all keep well. And don't forget to pick up Nandita's on online screens everywhere, and they can be delivered to you at home. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.